Hi, Mike Gibson coming to you live from SCAI 2017, and I'm joined by some of the luminaries in interventional cardiology, Spencer King, Bernhard Meier, probably trying to redo something with this microphone right now as an interventional cardiologist, intervening in some way, Joe Babb and George Vetrovec. 40 years of SCAI, 40 years of angioplasty. Spencer, take us through some of the history back to the beginning of all this.
Yeah, we'll talk about SCAI in a minute, but it's fascinating to me that interventional cardiology also is 40 years old.
Right.
So these two things are very tightly connected now, but in the beginning they weren't. In the beginning of angioplasty, of course, Bernhard Meier was a pivotal person because he in fact identified the first person to ever have angioplasty when he worked for Andreas Grünzig in Zurich.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that. How did you find a patient?
Yeah, well, that was quite an interesting story, particularly also for SCAI, which I know, has really fostered the availability of coronary angiography as a pivotal diagnostic instrument for coronary angioplasty and for coronary heart disease. And indeed, in Zurich at the time and probably around the world, coronary angiography was only done very late in the disease process. So as a result, usually what you found was triple vessel disease, poor ventricular function, because the people finally getting coronary angiography had the two infarctions before, had refractory angina, and just were not medically, to be calmed. So when Andreas Grünzig looked for his first case for over a year, actually almost 2 years, he had everything ready, but all the angiograms he looked at had triple vessel disease, and he was looking for a simple single vessel, single lesion patient. So it was only after almost 2 years of search that I just happened to see this angiogram done by a radiologist the day before. Grünzig just came back from looking for a first case in the United States where he wanted to start the angioplasty, not being able to find a patient in Switzerland. But he couldn't find one there either. Interesting, even in the United States, a week of research in a busy cath lab in San Francisco did not bring about a first doable patient. So when he came back, I showed him this case, a young person, 38 years of age, as was Grünzig at the time, by the way, with a single lesion in the proximal AD, severe intractable angina for 2 weeks, for which, interestingly, first an exercise stress test was done, which was highly positive at the time, and this particular case was an ideal case for Andreas, and he immediately jumped on it, did it the next day, and as we all know, up to the current date, the patient is still okay and free of bypass surgery.
So conventional balloon angioplasty worked.
It did.
Yeah, it
Absolutely.
did. Yeah.
Well, it worked for 23 years until Bernhard put a stent in it, and then he got restenosis. So
That's right.
Yeah.
So the first time it was a one-time procedure, second time it was a two-time procedure, stent, and then redilatation of a stent.
Yeah.
And since he has had 2 more interventions, so finally he had 4 additional interventions. That's not bad for 40 years of follow-up.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's really amazing. Joe, what have been some of the highlights for you over the past 40 years in interventional cardiology?
Well, I think I remember going to Andreas's course in January of 1980 and feeling it was the most remarkable educational experience I had ever been exposed to in my life, because here were the physicians performing the procedure who made the original diagnosis, presented the history and physical, disappeared for 5 to 10 minutes, and then appeared back on this full screen as they had walked down to the hospital and were on camera, and then watched the actual angioplasty done in real time. No editing, no nothing, real time. And watched the hands, watched the images. It was just remarkable.
Yeah.
And I went back and was so taken by this, I thought, I really want to be part of this. To understand, when I started down the medicine track, I was sure I wanted to be a surgeon until I got into my clinical rotation on surgery, and I found that the focus was a little too sharp for me. had a patient with gallbladder disease, diabetes, hypertension, presented it, surgeon said, well, we'll operate on the gallbladder tomorrow. And I said, what about the diabetes and hypertension? He said, that's not my problem. It's somebody else. I didn't like that, so I went over and went into cardiology. But the surgery type approach, the mechanics of it, just had a strong appeal.
Sure.
Well, that's, and we know that it came back. It's caught on slowly, progressively. I shouldn't say slowly, I think very rapidly and progressively. But the best part of the journey has been the collegiality and the shared information amongst participants, whether it's a new technique, a refinement of an old technique, data to show outcomes, but it's all been shared.
One of my favorite pictures is a picture of a chalkboard that had all your names on it with the number of cases you had done. You know the picture I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know it well. It said
that was
King,
David.
Atlanta.
Yeah.
4 cases, success 2. So,
Yeah. You wish that image would go away, right? So, yeah.
And is that why you went over to Zurich to recruit Andreas?
yeah, I figured maybe we could improve our results a little bit.
George, some of the highlights for you over 4 years? Of this?
Yeah, I think Bernie said something that probably requires some comment, and that is he talked about the first patient having an angiogram by radiologist, and I think we forget that. The SCAI, as it started, Society for Coronary Angiography, was a combination of both radiologist and cardiologist.
And
it was
physicists.
right, and it was a little more territorial than you might think. But on the other hand, I thought as a young catheterization learner and participant, I learned a lot from the radiologist about views and so forth. And so I think that was a very good foundation actually for at least my education. But I remember, and Spencer may remember this, presenting an abstract at one of the early meetings in which I presented the frequency of renal artery stenosis in patients with undergoing coronary angiography. And at least a half a dozen radiologists stood up and just crushed my presentation. And it was all about turf. And I finally stood up and said, Spencer gave me an opportunity to have the last word, and I remember saying, wait a minute, folks, this isn't about who does it or who bills for it. This is the scientific data. And no one knew that until today. And so, but it was really fun to think about, as you look back on it now, the coalescence of these things. So that's one of the things I think people have forgotten in the rush to really transform into intervention.
Absolutely. Spencer, 40 years, what have been some of the highlights?
Well, I think a highlight is the SCAI being developed for a purpose that's not, and the evolution is not unlike what the parallel with interventional cardiology is. They're very tightly interrelated. When SCAI started, and I think George and I maybe joined the second meeting that they had, the idea was lab standards, data quality, whatnot. So yes, everybody, a number of people were doing coronary angiograms and so forth, but there was very little control or organization or attempt to improve it. And not that Mason Soanes was an organizer, but he was an inspirational guy. Mel Judkins was very firm, and he was a radiologist. And the early guys we had developed the idea that we ought to be a little bit organized and figure out what we're doing and try to improve the quality of what we're doing, which at that time was diagnostic. And then we went through a period. I was the chairman of the, believe it or not, chairman of the interventional committee of the Society of Angiography. So it sounds weird now. And it became weird to us in the late 80s, leading up to 1990, when we said, we're doing intervention, that's what we do. And so we decided to change the name from Society for Angiography to Society for Intervention. And then the society was pivotal in pushing for, wait a minute, interventional cardiology needs to be better organized. we need to have an actual
And it's so easy to
subspecialty.
organize interventional cardiologists.
It's much easier now because we know who they are. In the beginning, we didn't know who they were. Whoever showed up in Zurich or Atlanta to go to a course and started doing it, and so there was very little understanding of who was doing it. Now, people become certified, they become qualified. We have certain standards, and that initiative with ABIM was driven by the society and ACC together, doing the best things, namely working together to get that done.
Yeah, I think it's important to know the importance that quality had in and registry data in the society. There was a registry from the beginning of the society, and it was a paper registry in which people filled out paper forms and sent them in, but the data was collated and it was published every year or two, so you kind of knew what the expected mortality was and so forth. And that was really way ahead of its time because people weren't talking registries so much.
That's right.
That's why I brought up the chalkboard, because from its inception, from its birth, interventional cardiology has been evidence-based. We've really looked at outcomes, and that has really been the way that this field has progressed, I think, in a more rapid way than many other field in medicine, and really is probably one of the most grounded in evidence of anything in medicine.
I agree with you, and I'm glad George brought that up because it was, I remember those early days, filling out the forms, and then they were encoded for the computer on a punch card.
Right, right. And a computer as big as this room, yes.
Slightly larger. But they were encoded on a punch card and then all tabulated, and we had the data. The intent was to find out, we all mean to do well. Query, are we doing well? Well, you don't know up here as much as put it on paper, and calculate it. And if we're failing someplace, okay, now I know where I need to focus my attention to improve. And it was really a gift from our early founders who pushed in this direction for all of us to become more focused on quality performance and data as it is data-driven, not opinion-driven.
Not eminence-based. All of you are very eminent, but evidence-based.
That's right.
Yes.
You got it.
Yeah. Well, guys, from the second generation, I want to thank you as the first generation in interventional cardiology. And
Kind way to put it.
you did trying to be politically correct here. But thank you. You really, all of you made such enormous contributions, and we're where we are today because of all you guys. Thanks.
Thank you
Thanks,
for the
Michael.
privilege of
Thanks
appearing.
to all of you for joining us here live from SCAI 2017.